Hello! In this video we'll be getting into face recognition and we'll be starting out with a clinical example. There are actually some individuals who are able to recognize that a face is in front of them, but they may not necessarily be able to tell you whose face it is. And it could be a friend, it could be a parent, it could be a stranger. They're going to have some level of difficulty with actually identifying the person just by their facial features. This phenomenon is known as prosopagnosia. It's another type of agnosia, and we've talked about several different types of agnosia in previous videos. And just like some of those other cases of agnosia, people with prosopagnosia seem to have relatively normal vision. So in this way, and as hinted in some of the integrated videos from earlier in the module, face recognition seems to be a special type of object recognition. And there are actually some clever ways you can see how this is the case. Let's switch things up a little bit and let me show you the evidence before I show you the example. So suppose in a form of a memory task, people are shown faces or houses. And then later they're tested and they're asked if they've seen this face or house before. Critically though, when those images were first presented, some of these faces and some of these houses were presented upside down. They were presented inverted. And when you look at the performance for these images, for houses, it doesn't really matter if the house was upright or upside down, the performance was basically the same for those two conditions. But for faces, something interesting happens. People were really good at remembering the upright faces, more so than houses, but they were really bad for the upside down faces. Again, worse than houses. So with this evidence, it supports our idea that there's something special about faces. Now let's go with the experience. What do you see when you look at these two faces? How similar do they look to one another? You might be able to tell that one's a little bit off by a little bit, but let me flip them right side up now. Okay, now what do you think about these faces? The one on the right is probably a little disturbing to you. And what's been done here is that the eyes and the mouth have been flipped upside down. They were right side up when the whole picture was flipped, but here they're upside down. And here you can very clearly tell that this is wrong. Why was that so hard to tell when they were upside down? Well, a lot of the things we had talked about in the past regarding object recognition had dealt with how individual parts are processed, and then eventually object recognition occurs. Face recognition, and some other types of visual expertise we'll touch on in a second, seem to depend on holistic perception, or the overall configuration of all the parts into a whole. So the features are still important, but the relationships between all of those individual pieces that make up the whole representation are really what is driving facial perception. The brain area that we tend to think about when we talk about facial perception is the fusiform face area. Oftentimes, if you use fMRI, you can see activity in the fusiform face area by showing people images of faces, but it's not necessarily limited to faces, despite being called the fusiform face area. Other types of visual expertise also seem to depend on this area to some extent, such as visual car expertise, people who are visual experts with cars and being able to tell different types of cars, make, model, and year apart at, the drop of a hat. Or bird experts are another category of visual experts, believe it or not. People who are, bird watchers and are very good at distinguishing different species by very subtle but holistic characteristics. And this idea that faces depend on holistic recognition isn't just supported by the Margaret Thatcher illusion, which is what we had just looked at. In a study where participants were asked to recognize the top half of faces, they actually had a much harder time recognizing the top half of the face if it was properly aligned with an incorrect bottom of the face. That is in contrast to this jarring separation that you see on the top right hand corner. In other words, when they were slightly separated like that, people had an easier time recognizing the top half of the face. So it seems like when two faces are put together in a way that evenly matches, but they are still two different faces, it messes with our holistic perception and we have a harder time identifying only the top half. And back when this study was done, they used faces that were easily recognizable. So in this case, it was Hugh Jackman and Justin Timberlake, back when they were relevant to anyone. But whether a face is familiar or not familiar can also influence facial recognition. When we're looking at a familiar face, we tend to rely on features that are within that face, the relationships between the eyes, the nose, the mouth, while for unfamiliar faces, we tend to focus on on some external features such as the hair or the head shape. And so in considering facial recognition, we can actually begin to point out some of the holes in these theories regarding feature nets. For faces in particular, it seems like it's not necessarily the features that lead to recognition, but the relationships among those features, that holistic processing. This doesn't align that nicely with some of the feature net theories that we had discussed. Additionally, this pre-existing knowledge can influence object recognition, like how words are more easily recognizable within the context of a sentence than completely alone, or the example that we had talked about, how letters within a word are easier detected than a singular letter, as well as how semantic priming can influence recognition. And semantic priming is something that we're going to get into a little bit more in memory a few weeks from now. But on that note, let's wrap up with how top-down influences, how our prior knowledge can influence object recognition. We're able to refer to some neuroscientific evidence suggesting that top-down influences can influence object recognition, because if you show people a very brief presentation of a target object, you're going to see activity in these orbital frontal areas, which are often involved in the process of decision making. And then about 50 milliseconds later, you see activity in the right fusiform area, suggesting successful object recognition. Or at least that's what activity in the area is associated with in this study. Now, importantly, we do not see this activity if you show the person the object for a large amount of time, if you give them several seconds to consider the object. And so this makes sense, doesn't it? Right? If you show a person an object for a very brief amount of time, then they're going to have to work with that sensory memory and sort of determine what exactly it was that they saw, because it was such limited information. Therefore, in these cases where the information is either ambiguous or limited, you should expect to see some more top-down influences, some more effortful use of prior knowledge and decision making and determining what it is that you saw, than in these cases where the object was obviously there and it was very clear to see, and then you can get more into bottom-up processing that is often emphasized in some of the theories we discussed. But that'll wrap up this module on object recognition. In the next module, we'll be getting into attention. I'll see you then.